version 52367. You will hear a number of different recordings, and you will have to answer questions on what you hear. There will be time for you to read the instructions and questions, and you will have a chance to check your work. All the recordings will be played once only. The test is in 4 parts. Write all your answers in the listening question booklet. At the end of the test, you will be given 10 minutes to transfer your answers to an answer sheet. Now turn to Part 1 on page 2 of your question booklet. Part 1. You will hear a school principal talking to a teacher who is going to organize an art competition. First, you have some time to look at questions 1 to 4. Now listen carefully and answer questions 1 to 4.
Hi, John.
Hi, Wendy. Thanks for coming to discuss the school art competition. I know this is your first year organising it.
Well, I've got some ideas, but I'd appreciate some help with arrangements.
OK. We usually divide the competition into age groups. The first age group is junior students.
I'll just note that down.
Last year, we went with a theme of family. That worked very well.
Yes, something simple is best for young children, I think. How about animals this year?
Sounds good. And for the type of art, last year children in the junior age group created a drawing. Shall we stick with that?
Yes. And for the prize, I heard last year we gave cinema tickets to the winner. Is that right?
Yes. But, you know, it might be nice to give the winners tickets to the zoo this time.
Good idea.
OK.
Finally, for the senior students, we also have to think of a theme. I've got a couple of ideas. One is the future.
I'm not quite sure how students might approach that theme. It could be tricky.
My other idea was the city. What do you think?
Good. Students could get some really interesting images with that theme.
And for the type of art, I think a photograph would work well.
Great idea. And as a prize, one of our sponsors is willing to donate a voucher that the winner can spend on travel.
Fantastic. They can find inspiration for their next artworks.
Before you hear the rest of the conversation, you have some time to look at questions 5 to 10. Now listen and answer questions 5 to 10.
Now, let's discuss some further details of the competition.
Sure. First of all, the deadline for submitting artwork. We want to award the prizes on May the 25th.
Last year we needed a week to judge the winners and finalise arrangements for the awards night. How about if entrants submit their artwork by May the 18th?
Sure. I'll just note that down. Where should they submit their artworks? At the office?
Actually, there's more space at the library, so let's ask students to take their art there.
OK. In terms of judging the competition, what did you do last year?
We used an excellent local artist. We should try and use her again this year. Her name is Rebecca Lee.
OK. Is that L-E-E?
No, it's Leigh.
Right. I guess I should also note down her number so that I can get in contact with her after we finalise the rest of the competition details.
Sure. I've got her number here. Are you ready? It's 0407 625 4633.
Got it. After the judging, where are we going to display the artworks? How about we book the Bridge Street Gallery? It's a beautiful old building.
It is. So can you go ahead and book it?
Yes. And do you think we should also publish the artworks in the school magazine?
Yes, definitely. I think the winning students would be delighted to see that.
Great. Now, in terms of the art exhibition of the students' work, should we make it a morning event and follow it up with a special lunch or afternoon tea for parents?
I was thinking a late afternoon event might be better so that parents can attend after work. After the exhibition, we could put on a dinner. What do you think?
Yes, that could be nice. Now,
That is the end of Part 1. You now have 1 minute to check your answers to Part 1. Part 2. You will hear a guide talking to a group of tourists who are going to spend a day on an island. First, you have some time to look at questions 11 to 14. Now listen carefully and answer questions 11 to 14.
Well, morning everyone. Welcome to Palm Island. First, I'll run through the plan for the day. So, the idea is that in the morning you'll go for a walk. There are actually a number of different walks on the island, so I'll describe each one and then you can choose. So there's the boundary walk. This is one of the longer walks and it will appeal especially to people who love the coastline. And in fact, the tide is out today, so it'll be perfect for exploring the very old rock formations behind the beach. A good option is the loop track. Now, this is quite short, but don't be misled by that because it's very hilly and you need to be quite fit. The reward, though, is that you'll be able to see right down the length of the island and even across to the mainland. It'll be pretty as a picture on a fine day like today. There's the Pururi Walk, which follows one of the earliest trails that was built on the island. Unfortunately, the track's been damaged slightly by a storm, but it's still passable. The nice thing is, about halfway there's a table and chairs. They've recently been restored and painted, in fact, and it's a great place to eat your packed lunch and have a rest. You could also walk up to North Head. This is an inland walk. You'll hardly get a glimpse of the sea the whole way, but the attraction is you'll pass through a large area of very old native bush. The number of birds is amazing, including several rare species. You'll find some are quite tame, but please don't give them any food.
Before you hear the rest of the talk, you have some time to look at questions 15 to 20. Now listen and answer questions 15 to 20.
Okay, well, after your walk, the bus will take you to the regional park where you can relax for a couple of hours before going home. Now, if you look at your maps of the regional park, I'll just describe a few things you can do. So the bus will drop you at the park entrance right at the bottom of the map. One interesting place is the bird colony. To get there from the park entrance, you go up the path to the lake. About halfway round the east side of the lake, you need to turn off and take the path all the way out to the coast. You'll find the colony there, overlooking a little island. Now, if you'd like a swim, remember that not all the beaches are really suitable in this wind. For the safest place, follow the path north from the park entrance, but before you get to the lake, turn right and go down there to the beach. Something that people find interesting is the old ship. It's more than 100 years old. To get there, just north of the park entrance, you take the path which heads towards Okiwi Bay. Then walk along the coast a little way before turning right and following that path over to Rocky Bay. You'll see the wharf, go past that, and the ship is just along there. A long walk, but one that's well worth it, is up to Stony Batter. You follow the path right around the lake to the far side and keep heading north. But if you reach the water tower, you've gone too far. Before that, you want to turn off to your left and take the path to the coast. Now, where else is there? Oh yes, the Settlers Monument. That's popular. So from the park entrance, take the first path on the left and follow it around behind Okiwi Bay. The monument is out at the end there on the headland. Finally, if all this exercise has made you thirsty, there's a kiosk where you can get hot and cold drinks. It's easy to find beside the lake, right on the water's edge. Well, now, if anyone has any questions, feel free.
That is the end of Part 2. You now have 30 seconds to check your answers to Part 2. Part 3. You will hear two music students discussing the results of a survey they have done. First, you have some time to look at questions 21 to 26. Now listen carefully and answer questions 21 to 26.
So, Gareth, we need to organise the findings from our survey on music students for the final presentation.
Yes, Lorna. I think we've got some very interesting results. Obviously, we need to start by saying that we interviewed all the third-year students doing a music degree and state the objective of our research project, that is, to find out about their attitudes to performing.
And then we should talk about the students' musical backgrounds before coming to university. The most important points to make are that although most people have actually composed music during the course, that wasn't the case when they arrived. And the other thing they had in common was the piano.
Well, they'd had access to a piano at some point, but not all had studied it formally. I thought the most interesting finding was that before coming here, almost everyone was involved in a chamber orchestra or band, or singing in a choir and playing in front of live audiences.
But varying enormously in size. Some had only played in tiny venues. I think it's worth saying that.
OK. And as you might expect from people wanting to study music, they all had a degree of proficiency in at least 2 instruments. But in most cases, one of the instruments was dominant.
Right. We need to talk about attitudes to music practice. The most striking thing here is that even students who you'd expect to practice for hours every day until they get it perfect say it's being terrified of failing that really makes them practice. I know I'm the same.
Me too. It's interesting what was said about practicing alone. Some people preferred that because they could focus more on their weak points.
But that wasn't a majority view. What most of them agree on is that there's nothing more rewarding than mastering something that's really hard to learn.
That's right. OK, after that, we should talk a bit about the pieces that students select for assessed performances.
There wasn't quite so much consensus on this, was there? A few people prefer to do pieces which are relatively unknown, while others choose the ones they think will show off their technical ability. But they were in the minority.
I think the first thing to say is that a high percentage said they would always try to learn their pieces by heart because it's too easy to get lost if you're trying to read and play when you're nervous.
OK. And quite a lot of them said it helps to listen to other people playing your chosen piece, preferably recordings, but even just other students.
Before you hear the rest of the discussion, you have some time to look at questions 27 to 30. Now listen and answer questions 27 to 30.
So finally, we need to look at the findings for students' attitudes to performing. We should point out that this includes informal and formal public performances as well as assessed ones.
Yes, that's important. I expected to find that performing solo would make students very nervous, but in fact that isn't the case.
They do find it hugely challenging to start with, but they appreciate the challenge and find it stimulating.
Right. I was surprised by what students said about deciding which pieces to perform. I thought they'd all say this was easy. For me, it's always been quite straightforward. Which pieces do I like best? And which pieces can I play well? And my repertoire is quite limited anyway. But the most commonly cited answer was that it took them ages to make their minds up.
I suppose it's because there are so many factors involved. You need to consider your audience, the venue, the time available to learn the piece, especially if it's complicated. You need to think about all these things, and you can't do that in a hurry.
That's true.
Then there's performing with musicians from a different genre, like a classical musician playing with a jazz group. That can really be fun.
But most of the music students had never even considered it.
Right. For performing with musicians who play the same instrument, almost everyone put the same thing.
Yes, they all said it was incredibly helpful, and not at all intimidating, which says a lot for the department's ethos.
Yes, that's a good point. OK, what I think we should sort out now.
That is the end of Part 3. You now have 30 seconds to check your answers to Part 3. Part 4. You will hear a zoology lecturer talking about a group of primitive animals called gastropods. First, you have some time to look at questions 31 to 40. Now listen carefully and answer questions 31 to 40.
Good morning, everyone. In this module, we've been looking at various field survey methods, and now I'm going to give you a brief introduction to the specific organism that we'll be focusing on during our first field trip, and that's the gastropod. Gastropods are invertebrates. They're organisms without a backbone, and they're more commonly known as snails, or if they haven't got a shell, slugs. Now, in terms of their evolution, gastropods go back a long way. As with other primitive animals, the minerals in their body fluids are very similar to the mineral composition of the sea, indicating that they began life there. And their fossilized remains have been found in rocks dating back at least 500 million years. Looking at the physical features of the gastropods, well, they all have one muscular foot for swimming or walking. This foot is lubricated with mucus, and it's this that leaves the sticky trail that you see behind snails and slugs. They also have an organ called a radula, which they use for feeding. Then, of course, the snails, though not the slugs, have a shell. In terms of their dimensions, snail shells in Britain range from the dwarf snail, which is 1.5 millimetres long, to the Roman snail, whose shell can be as big as 50 millimetres. As well as size variations, you get a lot of differences in the form of snail shells. For example, the majority coil to the right, but there are a few that coil to the left. Then some shells, for instance the plated snail, have regularly spaced ribs, while the prickly snail has prominent spines. There are even a number of species with hair on their shells. Colours on the shells also vary, as do patterns, so appearances are really varied. Okay, let's turn now to feeding habits. Most of you who are gardeners will know to your cost that some gastropods eat healthy plants. But you may not realise that these are the minority. Most species feed on rotting plants, or they eat fungi and algae. Some species eat dead animals, and there are some that are actually carnivorous. They prey on live animals. For example, the shield slug feeds on worms. And apart from their own feeding habits, I should point out that gastropods themselves have plenty of predators. Birds and frogs are the main ones. But there's even an entire family of flies that have specialised in preying on gastropods. And of course, last but not least, I should mention human predators. It was the Romans who probably first introduced edible snails into Britain during the 1st century, and they are still eaten today. In fact, the collection of wild snails for cooking has caused local extinctions of one species, which is also under threat internationally. So there are lots of predators, but to protect themselves, gastropods have often developed special defences. I'll just give you one example. The glutinous snail avoids predators by folding its mantle over its shell and turning itself into a very slippery blob of jelly. Well, turning now to gastropod habitats, most species like dampness and shade. In general, both very hot and very cold weather is bad for gastropods, but dry conditions are the least favourable. Snails cope with this by withdrawing into their shells, and often they form a thick film of mucus over the mouth of their shell to minimise loss of water. Habitats with a long, stable history tend to support the biggest range of gastropod species. So, for instance, long-established forests usually support more species than newer plantations of trees, and old, natural meadowland is much better than land which has recently been farmed. And there is a small number of highly specialised species that live in unusual habitats. For instance, the blind snail spends its whole life buried under the ground. It's been reported living at depths of 2 metres, and particularly likes the cavities in old, buried bones, apparently. But species like these are exceptional. But wherever they live, gastropods are often sensitive to pollution, and they don't thrive in areas contaminated by agrochemicals. This means that they are a reliable indication of how healthy our environment is. Now, at this point, I'd like to consider habitat management in relation.
That is the end of Part 4. You now have 1 minute to check your answers to Part 4. That is the end of the listening test. You now have 10 minutes to transfer your answers to the listening answer sheet. You have 2 minutes left. You have 1 minute left. Please stop writing and wait for your question booklet to be collected.